because the free world has to show now that is ready to oppose this rise of new dictatorships that are threatening the very existence of the world order that we used to live in.
Yeah, well, they want a new world order. China, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin in Russia.
And this has taken us by storm. I mean, this is like a watershed moment. It's happening on the scale of an entire country of 40 million people. This is only something that we read about in books, saw in movies, and all of a sudden we are living those movies and those books.
So you and I might ask the question, how are things going to play out in the Ukraine?
We all know that also the next step that we see is a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And I know that everybody is saying, no, the Third World War will start. I will be very blunt with you. It has already started because the attack on a nuclear plant, again, affects everybody.
Meanwhile, Russia has become increasingly isolated and its economy is in free fall. Death and destruction on the ground in Ukraine, a massive exodus of refugees, as we've just been hearing.
Vladimir Putin is trying to control the talking points, banning media outlets from using the term war when talking about the ongoing attacks. At least 2 independent Russian news outlets that refuse to share his talking points have been forced off the air this morning, and in an effort to intimidate journalists, the Russian parliament has just passed a new rule that basically puts a 15-year prison sentence on anyone who reports, quote, fake news, at least the way they view it. Guys.
Those pictures.
Unbelievable, right?
It looks very residential, Ron. I mean, I don't know. I know they were talking about going after military targets. Those didn't look military to me.
Not at all.
With every passing day, this war is becoming bigger. With every passing day, this war is pulling in more countries. Think about it. Our world is already fighting multiple wars. Experts believe China's conflict with Taiwan will turn into a military conflict sometime in the next decade. China is also fighting multiple countries in the South China Sea. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei. India and China are caught in a standoff. There is a conflict between Iran and Israel. Iran and the United States. The United States and North Korea are arch enemies. So are the United States and Cuba. There is also a war in Syria, a war in Yemen. Israel and Palestine are fresh out of a bloody battle. The United Arab Emirates was recently hit by missiles. It is hard to rule out that countries or non-state actors will seize on a distracted world and pursue their geopolitical dreams. It is hard to rule out that an escalation on the sidelines of Ukraine will drag in more countries.
We are entering day 6 of war as several Ukrainian cities are under attack this morning.
But I have traveled in conflict zones and done some reporting. And I remember being in Tripoli and Benghazi during the NATO attacks and the freedom fighters fighting as well as against the Gaddafi forces. And it was sketchy, but this was ominous. It was ominous because it was so heartbreaking in the ripple effects it's going to have around the world where this incredible symbol of democracy, a belief in free dreaming, is being assaulted. And they're fighting for their lives, and they're going to continue to fight for their lives. And I start to feel that we as Americans are plummeting off a cliff, atop which is our flag that represents all of our dreams and the best of our history, and that we're plummeting where it's going to go out of sight. I don't know the answers. I don't know if no-fly zones will create a nuclear war.
Western leaders have repeatedly said that Russia's invasion challenges the world order. Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, I think the world order is being changed by the invasion of Ukraine. The world is a much more dangerous place today than a week ago.
And the fear, I suppose, is that other authoritarian regimes are watching this play out and could use it to their advantage, learn how to make a military move of their own.
Mr. Grossi, before I let you go, we have to ask about Iran.
International pressure, crippling sanctions, and even the threat of war. So far, nothing has discouraged Iran from its nuclear ambitions. Some analysts say its determination is part of Tehran's strategy.
Vladimir Putin, and don't forget, Iran has been brought into the fold as well. They were doing military exercises, the three of them, and the U.S. is trying to get the U.S., this administration trying to get the U.S. back into an Iran nuclear deal.
Iran has long desired nuclear technology. Following the Islamic Revolution in 1979, most countries cut off all nuclear cooperation with Tehran. And without reliable foreign fuel supplies, Iran started developing its own nuclear program. But as a consequence, it has been under economic sanctions since the 1990s. The West has been suspicious of the country's venture into nuclear energy, especially because of the high cost it has paid. Some experts also say it makes little sense, considering Iran is among the world's richest in natural resources. But Iran says its goals are peaceful, and it needs nuclear power to diversify its energy sector, as its oil fields will eventually be depleted. By giving up much control of its nuclear activities with the 2015 deal, Iran has also hoped to convince the West that it only means peace. Since the US left the agreement in 2018, Iran has deployed centrifuges that can produce nuclear fuel more quickly and brought its uranium enrichment program closer to weapons-grade level. Some analysts say just by having the technology that could be used to make a bomb, Iran would increase its sense of security and gain political influence in the Middle East.
Far from building bridges, China has been increasingly threatening its neighbor with its military. The numbers of Chinese Air Force incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone have gone up, as has the rhetoric from Beijing. China views Taiwan as a renegade province that needs to be reunited with the mainland.
We've seen China already tighten its grip on Hong Kong, warn Taiwan, encroach on Nepal's borders, and of course there are these tensions never ending in the South China Sea. If China were to make a military move, where do you think it would be?
Well, it will be Taiwan. Taiwan is absolutely central to the maritime strategy of China. This goes even beyond or before Xi Jinping. And if China can take Taiwan, it will have done so against American wishes, meaning that either the Americans are deterred or the Americans are defeated. Either way, it will fundamentally change the balance of power in the entire Indo-Pacific region.
Still, the greatest fear is that Taiwan is next on the list. And if that happens, we are in serious, serious trouble economically, militarily, and politically, because China will then control the flow of trade around the entire globe. Supply chain problems, you'll yearn for the day when we were dealing with a lack of toilet paper.
Our fellow journalist was just saying that it seems in Ukraine like Second World War, and it does, because Putin is trying to rebuild the Russian Empire or Soviet Union and drag all of us to the past, and we want to go to the future.
What about the Second World War? Flashback 1939. Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. Once again, it has a domino effect. Before you know it, the whole world is fighting. At least 50 million people are dead. Again, it all began with one country invading another.
The battle in Ukraine, it's a battle for the future of our world. It's a front line of freedom now.
Well, some say Russia's invasion of Ukraine has started a new era. What good are political boundaries in the face of a nuclear arsenal and defiance from an authoritarian leader? Those are questions being asked around the world.
In Israel, it is often referred to as a war in between wars on a variety of levels. For years, Israel's Air Force has also allegedly carried out strikes in neighboring Syria to prevent the entrenchment of Iranian forces or proxy militias. The overall aim to slow down Iran's nuclear program and its influence in the region.
Nobody wants a war in the Middle East, no question about that. At the same time, one has to remember that Israel is the only country that is threatened by Iran to be annihilated off the map.
That's why talks between world powers and Iran in Vienna to revive the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, also known as JCPOA, are being so closely watched here. The country has reportedly set aside a significant government budget to prepare the Israeli military for a potential strike on Iran.
The main show is Vienna. Israel is trying to create an alternative to what's going on the table in Vienna. So we are trying to produce a viable military option, which Israel is still working on.
In the meantime, the war in between wars continues. Experts say a nuclear Iran would change the whole region and could lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
A return to energy dependence. Do you realize that 7% of our oil now comes from Russia? 7% of the oil that we process in the United States comes from Russia. But maybe more telling is that the United States' influence as a trusted partner amongst other nations has been pretty much decimated through the Arab Spring, which instead of bringing democracy and liberty to the Middle East, propped up some of the worst despots and has led to the deaths of millions of people through this internecine warfare that goes on amongst them.
We know Russia's economic might in part rests on fossil fuels. It's the world's biggest exporter of natural gas and the second biggest exporter of crude oil. That's worth over $160 billion a year. And this is one of Russia's biggest income streams. As the Harvard economist Jason Furman puts it, Russia is incredibly unimportant in the global economy except for oil and gas. It's basically a big gas station.
But you see the whole idea, and we understand, what's the end game here? Why would somebody go into a country like Ukraine with nothing really to gain? Well, first of all, it's the breadbasket of Europe. It's the largest wheat producer in the world. It also produces a ton of agricultural products. But more importantly, all of the Russian fuel lines, energy lines, gas and natural gas, go through Ukraine and into Europe. So whoever controls those fuel lines controls Europe. Because Europe as a whole gets 30% of its energy from Russia, through Ukraine, through Nord Stream 1. And amazingly, our current placeholder in the White House invited Russia to continue building Nord Stream 2, which would have increased dependency. The Germans, who do not like us, have never been our friends, and I think many of them still think they should have won World War II, basically have been complicit, along with Italy and other countries in Europe, in trying to displace the United States. And we'll touch on that very briefly, but it's a big issue. So that if Putin is successful, Europe could be forced into submission, especially because we no longer produce any excess energy to be able to replace what Russia provides for them now. Most of us begin to realize that not only causes disruption, it really would require the reordering of our entire life. It's a powerful thing when you're talking about factories that run this stuff. And of course, because Europe has been much more aggressive in pursuing climate change, they've shut down all of their nuclear plants. And the same plan is going on here, where the Energy Department under the current administration has just refused to relicense 2 nuclear energy plants in Florida that have been operating since 1973. With no explanation, other than the fact that we have to move away from the cleanest form of energy in the world. You know, it's interesting. As John McCain put it so, as he often did in a very comical way, he said, Russia is nothing else but a gas station with nuclear weapons. In a very real sense, even to this day, 50% of their income is oil. 50%. Their economy runs on it. And, you know, it was really interesting. People saying, why didn't he do this during the Trump era? Well, think about it. We were energy sufficient. We didn't have to import oil. And we started supplying natural gas to the European nations so they wouldn't be dependent upon Russian oil. But, you know, because the most important crisis facing the world today is climate change, Our government, in its immeasurable wisdom, decided that what we need to do is become energy dependent upon others. So Europe shut down most of their nuclear plants, got rid of all their coal-burning energy plants, as China is building them daily. China puts up one coal plant a day to produce enough energy to keep their engine going forward. And they're buying one of the resources. Their coal comes from Russia. They have entered into alliance and agreement now that they're buying Russian oil in huge numbers in order to continue to support and provide funds for the Russian economy. But you see, we looked at Russia as being a defeated enemy with no hope of coming back, that we viewed them as being like Germany after World War II. And we looked at China as this giant market to be exploited. And in that regard, corporate greed and political corruption induced our government and business elites to start feeding the dragon until it has become so big and so dominant that now we live in fear of it. Over that time, China has become the sole provider of 90% of our pharmaceuticals. Realize that 90% of the drugs that you pick up in the drugstore are produced by China. 90% of computer chips produced by China. 90% of our rare earth metals that we need to run our engines of industry are mined in China. They also own or control a significant percentage of the major corporations. When you think about Disney and the NBA and other groups like that will do anything that the Chinese tell them to do and will be silent about abuses that are obvious, people like LeBron, who has nothing to say about the Uyghurs and so forth, you realize that the reason they're doing this, as one of the owners of the Golden State Warriors, who himself is a billionaire, readily admitted in an interview, nobody cares about the Uyghurs. Why? Because they're making millions. I mean, they're making billions of dollars in profits by their coalition and colluding with the Chinese. One senior U.S. diplomat said recently, the greatest risk facing the U.S. in the 21st century is a two-front war involving its strongest military rivals, China and Russia. Part of our reluctance, and I'm not anxious for it, but part of our reluctance from taking stronger measures against Russia and the Ukraine is the fact that we can't afford to fight on two fronts. Even though our military doctrine for decades has been to be able to fight a two-front war, because we did during World War II, the idea has been we can't afford to that. And they just cut the military budget by several hundreds of millions of dollars this year. A former Prime Minister of Sweden, a guy named Carl Bildt, who's still a respected commentator on international affairs, said, what has not yet been fully appreciated is the possibility of both happening simultaneous in a more or less coordinated fashion. First Ukraine, then Taiwan. These two acts of conquest would fundamentally shift the global balance of power, sounding the death knell for global peace for decades. This is what made China's response to the invasion so fascinating. Despite U.S.'s pleadings to do what they can to dissuade them, it's interesting, they accidentally leaked something to their news agencies by one of the senior editors of one of their main news distributors in China. And he said this, he said, China needs to back up Russia while refraining from treading on the toes of the United States and the European Union, for in the future, China will need Russia's understanding and support when wrestling with America to solve the Taiwan issue once and for all. So what was China's response to the invasion of Ukraine? They sent a squadron of fighters into Taiwan airspace. That was their response. Because by the time we get to the book of Revelation, we find there are two sole powers left in the world. One is China, At least it calls the kings of the Orient or Asia. And the other is a confederacy of nations built around a reconfigured world empire that is called the Empire of the Beast and the Antichrist. But we'll have to get into that. It's a lot of detail behind that.